What's with this old place? Let's cancel and go somewhere newer.
Grinning foolishly, he insulted the restaurant solely because of its slightly aged exterior. Patricia and George looked shocked and immediately apologized.
David, what are you saying?
We're so sorry for David's behavior.
But David, dissatisfied with their reaction, criticized them.
Dad, Mom, I agreed to come because I heard Sarah's parents were going to host us. But look at this, bringing us to such an outdated restaurant.
There was absolutely no subtlety in his words. David completely misinterpreted our intentions and was spiraling out of control. As he continued spewing more insults toward us, Charles, who had been sitting beside me, suddenly stepped forward.
Then you can go alone, you brat.
His voice, low and guttural, came from deep within, paired with an expression of anger I had never seen before. Even David was visibly shaken.
Brat?
David repeated Charles' words, his face twisting awkwardly. My name is Victoria, and I'm 55 years old. I run a cooking class as a hobby, which allows me to connect with people in the community and enjoy peaceful, fulfilling days. I have one child, a daughter named Sarah. She's bright, energetic, and has a way of treating everyone equally, which makes me incredibly proud. My husband, Charles, is a quiet man, but for more than 20 years of our marriage, he has loved me deeply and made my life full of happiness. I truly adore my family. Sarah turned 25 this year, and it's been 3 years since she graduated from college and started her career. I had a feeling she might soon find someone special and bring him home, and it looks like that's exactly what happened. One day, Sarah suddenly called me. She sounded so happy and shared this news with me.
Mom, he proposed to me the other day. We haven't been dating for very long, but he's so sincere and kind. I just know he's the one for me. I couldn't wait to tell you.
Hearing the joy in her voice, I couldn't help but feel thrilled too. I immediately congratulated her, saying, "That's wonderful, Sarah. I remember when you were little, you'd sometimes say your dream was to become a bride. Your dad will be so happy, though he might get teary before anything else." I joked, and Sarah laughed. Sure, there's a part of me that feels a bit lonely knowing Sarah is getting married. But at the same time, it's such a joy to know that someone has chosen Sarah, who we've raised so lovingly, to be their life partner. When is your fiancé coming over? When I asked her that, Sarah thought for a moment before answering.
Next month.
Since we didn't have any plans for next month, and Charles, having retired last year, only had to work around his golf and fishing schedule, it seemed like it would work out. After coordinating the details with Sarah, we finalized the date for her partner's visit to formally introduce himself. This turned out to be a pivotal moment that would greatly impact our lives. On the much-anticipated day, under the clear blue sky, I was hanging laundry when I noticed a car pull up in front of our house. I went to check and saw Sarah stepping out of the passenger seat of a luxury car. Our eyes met, and she smiled brightly as she spoke.
Mom, it's been a while. Thanks so much for making time for us today.
The last time I saw Sarah was over 6 months ago, during the holidays when she came home. She hadn't changed much since then, but perhaps because her partner was with her, Sarah's expression seemed a little softer, almost like that of a woman in love. It was clear she was very fond of her partner, David. As Sarah and I were enjoying our heartfelt reunion, someone stepped out of the driver's seat. He had light brown hair and wore sleek black sunglasses. This was David, Sarah's partner. I was stunned into silence. This wasn't the first time Sarah had dated someone. Back in high school, she had 2 boyfriends, and both had a more conventional, studious appearance. I'm not one to judge people by appearances, but David was completely different from the type of person Sarah had dated before, which caught me off guard. I nervously broke the silence. "Nice to meet you. I'm Sarah's mother, Victoria." As I introduced myself, David adjusted his sunglasses slightly and glared at me with his narrow eyes from behind them. The atmosphere turned awkward, but Sarah quickly picked up on it and said,
Well, standing out here isn't great. Let's go inside.
Her intervention saved the moment for me. However, even at that point, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. When David's eyes, filled with what felt like disdain, locked onto mine, a chill ran down my spine. I hoped it was all in my head, but at that point, I couldn't be sure. I led them to the living room and served some drinks and snacks, but David silently began helping himself without saying a word. Sitting next to me, Charles furrowed his brow as he watched. Normally, you'd at least say something before helping yourself. But David devoured the snacks in silence, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, and my earlier unease began to feel like it might not be unfounded. Then Sarah spoke up first.
David, if you want something, you should say so properly. Mom, Dad, I'm sorry. He doesn't mean any harm.
I couldn't believe my ears. Not only did Sarah not criticize David's behavior, but she actually defended him. Sarah had always been a polite, conscientious girl with a strong sense of justice, so I couldn't imagine her overlooking such actions. What has changed Sarah so much? Charles and I exchanged a glance, both of us struggling to keep our expressions neutral. I decided to break the tension and asked David a question. "So David, what do you do for work?" David slowly turned toward me. With a look that said he couldn't care less, he replied,
Well, construction.
and that was the end of the conversation. The room was filled with an indescribable awkwardness. I glanced at Charles, gave him a small nod, and turned to speak to David again. Well, Sarah told us about the wedding plan so suddenly that we're half excited, half surprised. Have you two been dating for a long time?
Well,
David groaned and began curling his fingers one by one. When he folded 4 fingers, he said,
well, about 4 months, I guess. I just wanted to settle down quickly, so I told Sarah we could get married if she got pregnant.
At that moment, it felt like a jolt of electricity shot through my head. A relationship that short is already concerning in itself. But I didn't want to dismiss their values outright, so I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. However, the idea of getting married if she gets pregnant felt way too casual to me. It seemed entirely out of order. Ideally, they would live together first or take some time to solidify their feelings before discussing marriage. But I didn't sense any of that seriousness from David. He gave off the impression that he started dating Sarah on a whim, and if she happened to get pregnant, marriage would just be the next step. This filled me with even more anxiety. Can Sarah really find happiness in a marriage like this? Still, it's not our decision to make, it's Sarah's. I held back all the things I wanted to say, forcing a smile as I responded to David. Oh, I see. So, Sarah, you... When I glanced at Sarah's lower abdomen, she lovingly placed her hands over it and shared the news that she was expecting. Of course, I was thrilled about the idea of a grandchild. But deep down, both Charles and I probably had some reservations. I decided to ask Sarah directly. "You've chosen this marriage for yourself, right? I know the short dating period and the pregnancy are factors, but we're not opposed to it. If it's your decision, we'll support you. And David, are you ready to make Sarah and the baby happy?" Sarah nodded firmly in response to my words. That's when I realized Sarah is no longer just our daughter. She's a woman ready to take on motherhood. Her determined gaze made it clear, and Charles and I decided not to say anything further. Still, I couldn't shake my concerns about David. Even when I asked if he was ready for this commitment, his vague, uninterested expression made it impossible to tell what he was thinking. For now, since the day was just meant for introductions, we saw them off as they drove away in their luxury car. Immediately after that, an incident occurred. One afternoon, as I was preparing for my cooking class, David's car pulled up in front of our house. Wondering what he could possibly want, I glanced out the window. At that moment, David stepped out of the car, and our eyes met. His sharp glare was so intense it made me shrink back in fear. In a deep, gruff voice, he said,
You're loaded, right? Then cover the delivery costs.
At first, I couldn't understand what he was saying. But as David continued speaking, the situation became clear.
Look, I don't have money, so I'm asking you to pay for Sarah's delivery costs. I came alone today because I want to keep up appearances in front of Sarah. You're her mom, so it should be no problem for you to cover this, right?
I was stunned by how casually he said it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Does Sarah know this side of David and still want to marry him? But the fact is, Sarah is pregnant, and if they really don't have the money, it'll be Sarah who suffers in the end. Reluctantly, I handed David the minimum amount needed, a few $1,000s. He took the money, checked the contents, and drove off without even saying thank you. Shortly after, my cooking class students began to arrive, and their presence helped me regain my composure.
Are you okay?
Yes, I'm fine. Even though they expressed concern, I could only give a surface-level response. That evening, while sitting at the dinner table, I told Charles about what had happened earlier. Actually, David came by and asked for the delivery costs. I thought Charles might be confused since I jumped straight into the main point without any context. However, to my surprise, he wasn't. It seemed he also had his own thoughts about David.
I had a feeling something like this might happen. But still, I didn't expect it to be this blatant. I can't imagine how crushed Sarah would feel if she found out.
After all, Sarah's well-being is always our top priority. Since she's pregnant, we can't risk causing her unnecessary stress. At the same time, confronting David directly seemed like a risky move. After 30 minutes of deliberation, we came to a conclusion. The next day, when I told Sarah about this plan over the phone, she sounded delighted.
A meeting between both families, right? That sounds great. You know, his parents were hesitant because I'm pregnant, but if you and Dad want to do it, then we definitely should.
From what I could gather, David's parents seemed reasonable, but Sarah was probably in the throes of love, blinded to any flaws. Even if his parents turned out to be difficult people, Sarah might be too smitten to notice. So I suggested hosting a gathering to welcome David and his parents. We're going to be family soon, so it's only natural to show them hospitality. David's parents immediately agreed, and the date was quickly set. On the appointed day, at a high-end restaurant we had reserved, Sarah, Charles, and I waited for David and his parents to arrive. After a while, David's car pulled into the parking lot, and his parents stepped out. His mother, Patricia, gave a calm and sophisticated impression, while his father, George, seemed cheerful and easygoing. It became clear that David was the odd one out. A few minutes later, after parking his car, David joined us and abruptly said something that left us speechless.
What's with this old place? Let's cancel and go somewhere newer.
Grinning foolishly, he insulted the restaurant solely because of its slightly aged exterior. Patricia and George looked shocked and immediately apologized.
David, what are you saying?
We're so sorry for David's behavior.
But David, dissatisfied with their reaction, criticized them.
Dad, Mom, I agreed to this because I heard Sarah's parents were hosting you too. But look at this. They've brought us to some rundown restaurant. They're clearly looking down on us. I was trying to be polite and subtly say the place wasn't good, but now.
There was absolutely no subtlety in his words. David completely misinterpreted our intentions and was spiraling out of control. As he continued spewing more insults toward us, Charles, who had been sitting beside me, suddenly stepped forward.
Then you can go alone, you brat.
His voice, low and guttural, came from deep within, paired with an expression of anger I had never seen before. Even David was visibly shaken.
Rat?
David repeated Charles's words, his face twisting awkwardly. The atmosphere grew tense and uncomfortable. It was Sarah who broke the silence with trembling words.
What's going on? Something feels different, like the atmosphere isn't the same as usual.
She glanced nervously at David, her expression filled with confusion and anxiety. David, clearly annoyed, scratched the back of his head roughly and coldly replied,
For me, it's not so much that I love Sarah. It's more that she's carrying my child, and that sealed the deal. Look, I'm already 28, so it makes sense to settle down and have kids. Sarah got pregnant after just 4 months of dating and still accepted me, so I figured we could just keep things casual and easy from here on out.
Hearing those words, Sarah staggered, and I hurriedly caught her. I glared at David with rising anger and berated him. How could you say something like that? Sarah is not only your wife, but is also carrying your child. How dare you make such an awful remark? While David remained indifferent, Patricia and George repeatedly apologized, creating a stark contrast. As I wondered how to handle this situation, Charles spoke up slowly.
Fine. Just know this. I will never work with a company that employs a man who treats Sarah this way.
Hearing those words, David tilted his head, clearly puzzled. He probably couldn't grasp what Charles was implying. But as his wife, I, of course, knew exactly what kind of work Charles had done. He had been the director of a major construction firm in the area, well known and respected. Although Charles is now retired and has stepped back from the front lines, his influence remains significant. The CO still holds Charles in high regard, and even after his retirement, there have been many requests for him to return as a part-time consultant or advisor. Because of this, it would be incredibly easy for Charles to put pressure on the company where David works. David's expression shifted to one of sudden panic.
What? That's completely unacceptable. Cutting off a subcontractor for personal reasons is against the rules.
But Charles, unfazed by David's protest, smirked and replied,
Contracts are built on trust. If it were a direct agreement with the company I worked for or with companies I have a close relationship with, that would be one thing. But if it's a loose, occasional arrangement where work is given or not given depending on the situation, what do you think might happen? If you care even a little about your company, start by apologizing.
Clearly intent on making David apologize, Charles pressed on assertively. Realizing that his company could face consequences, David furrowed his brow but reluctantly muttered,
Fine. I'm sorry. I admit I was careless. But what's the point of forcing an apology like this? I could just be saying it to get through the moment.
His words all but confirmed he wasn't truly remorseful. While Patricia and George continued apologizing profusely, their son, David, remained sullen, glaring at us with visible annoyance. I thought that realizing his job might be affected would prompt David to offer at least a proper apology, but it seemed he lacked that kind of pride. So Charles decided to change his approach.
Well, fine. If you don't feel like apologizing, there's no need to force it. But if you can maintain that attitude after seeing this, I might just commend you for having some nerve.
As Charles said this, he fumbled slightly with his phone, navigating it awkwardly until he opened the photo gallery. He turned the screen toward us to show a picture, and what we saw was so shocking that everyone was left speechless.
What is this photo? Why does David look so close with another woman?
The picture showed David at a construction site, standing unusually close to a woman in work attire. At first glance, it could be mistaken for a friendly moment, but their proximity was far too intimate. As Charles scrolled further, he revealed a photo that left no doubt. It was undeniable evidence of David's infidelity and an embarrassing scene for him. Patricia and George froze in shock, while David snatched the phone from Charles, his face turning crimson.
Why do you even have a photo like this?
Charles gave a small chuckle as he responded to David, whose voice was trembling.
Because someone caught you openly fooling around with another woman behind the work site. If your client found out you were engaging in such behavior on their property, this would go far beyond mere anger.
David couldn't muster a response and simply stood there trembling. Charles then revealed the source of the photo. It was taken by one of his former co-workers.
The team had heard rumors about some inappropriate behavior, so during a break, one of them decided to check it out and caught you in the act. From what I've been told, the woman in question is married. It's a serious issue, so they sent me the photos, knowing I might be able to advise them.
Charles had known about this for a few days, ever since Sarah brought David to their home. He had been waiting for the right moment to bring it up. His top priority was to avoid hurting Sarah. But now that the situation had escalated, Charles decided it was time to confront David and protect Sarah. His eyes burned with a father's unwavering determination. Realizing that continuing this way would inconvenience the restaurant we had reserved, we decided to head inside. Of course, the atmosphere was oppressively heavy, making it far from a setting conducive to enjoying a meal. However, with both families gathered, it was the perfect opportunity to have a serious discussion. Patricia and George, looking formal and composed, sincerely apologized and expressed regret for David's behavior. David, on the other hand, still hadn't acknowledged his wrongdoing and sat there with a sullen expression. Finally, Sarah, who had remained silent until now, spoke up and voiced her criticism of David.
So, you didn't really want to marry me because you loved me? Was it just because you wanted a child? Do you even care about me at all?
Seeing the uncertainty in Sarah's trembling eyes, my heart ached. I decided to ask her why she had chosen to marry David. Sarah, why did you decide to marry David? He's so different from the type of person you usually date. I wondered about it from the beginning. Understanding my question, Sarah began to speak hesitantly.
You're right. He's not the type I'd normally be attracted to. But when we started dating, he made me feel like I was his top priority. He didn't talk much, but I could feel that he cared about me. That's why I thought about marriage. After all, Dad doesn't talk much either, but he's always shown how much he loves you. I thought David might be the same way.
I never expected Charles to come up in the conversation at this point. It seemed Sarah had grown up watching her quiet but loving father and assumed David would be the same way. However, when the truth came to light, it became clear that to David, it didn't matter who the person was. It just happened to be Sarah who got pregnant. This realization left me heartbroken. To think that a man could treat Sarah, whom we had lovingly raised, in such a way, and then have the audacity to not offer a proper apology. It was utterly unforgivable. Anger welled up inside me. While I refrained from further criticizing Patricia and George, who had been apologizing profusely, I decided to direct sharp words at David, determined to make him take responsibility for his actions as a grown man. You trampled all over Sarah's feelings. You promised marriage, got her pregnant, and yet you're involved with another woman. I can't even believe you. This photo, based on the date, was clearly taken after you met Sarah. It proves that you have no real feelings for her. Do you have any argument against that? I asked as calmly as I could. In truth, I wanted to shout, but I knew that if I lost my composure, the entire conversation would fall apart. Naturally, David didn't offer any rebuttal. That silence essentially confirmed that he truly had no feelings for Sarah. Realizing this, Sarah broke down, tears streaming from her eyes uncontrollably. As a pregnant woman, her emotions were already fragile, and David's treatment made me despise him all the more. But I had decided that this would be the day to put an end to David's foolishness. Taking a deep breath, I said, "Then let's just annul this marriage. Or did you think I was going to say that?" Everyone except me looked shocked at my words. Since their marriage was still new, a quick divorce would only require simple discussions over custody and property division. But I realized that would give David an easy escape, so I decided to take a different approach to make him understand the gravity of his actions. Let me make this clear. You are forbidden from approaching Sarah again. For now, Sarah will stay with Charles and me. We won't proceed with an immediate divorce, but instead, we'll calculate the compensation for your infidelity and determine child support for the future. If you try to run away, that'll only make things worse, so for now, we'll keep things as they are. As I said this, David immediately protested.
Is there even a point to that? At this rate, divorce is inevitable, so we should just get it over with quickly.
Sarah, noticing his urgency, gave him a suspicious look and asked,
Why are you in such a hurry to get divorced? It feels like everything is moving too smoothly, almost as if it's been planned. Maybe Mom is right. Maybe it's better to maintain the current situation and move forward with a separation first.
Patricia and George agreed with her suggestion, but for some reason, David looked extremely flustered. That day ended with everyone eating their meals in awkward silence, before we finally parted ways. David still seemed dissatisfied.
Come on, we're already done. Let's just go ahead with the divorce, all right?
Even as we left the restaurant and parted ways, he was still saying this to Sarah. There was clearly something suspicious about his behavior. Sarah seemed to sense it too, and she firmly declared that she wouldn't proceed with a divorce just yet. After returning home, we gathered in the living room to plan our next steps. With the evidence of David's infidelity, it would be easy to demand compensation and proceed with a divorce. But the real issue was the child.
David is really fixated on the baby. At first, I thought he was just someone who loves kids, but now it feels more like he sees having a child as a status symbol. I'm confident I'll win custody, but it's going to be a tough, drawn-out battle.
I hugged Sarah tightly as she sat there looking so uncertain. Even though I thought she had grown up so much, holding her in my arms brought back memories of cradling her as a baby. Knowing that someone as precious as Sarah had been hurt by David only made me more furious. And so, after 2 hours of strategizing, we all went to bed to prepare for what lay ahead. The next day, right on schedule, David, likely dragged along unwillingly by Patricia and George, stood at our front door. Seated at the dining table, David remained completely silent, refusing to say a word. The atmosphere felt like an interrogation. Although it had only been a day since the last confrontation, and we didn't have much new information, we had plenty of evidence to confront David. David sat slumped, glancing nervously at his parents seated on either side of him. I sat directly across from him and spoke. "There are other women you've deceived besides Sarah, aren't there?" Perhaps because I jumped straight to the point, David snapped his head up and stared at me intently. His lips moved slightly, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said,
How do you know that?
The answer was simple. David's overly confident and overly familiar demeanor struck me as practiced, as if he had done this before. That's when something clicked. I thought of a young single mother who attends my cooking class. She had once shared that she had unknowingly married a man who turned out to be a marriage scammer. After giving birth, he suddenly became cold, leading her to decide on a divorce. She had even gone through a bitter custody battle. Remembering how Sarah mentioned David's obsession with children, I decided to reach out to that student. Sure enough, I hit the mark. Her ex-husband turned out to be none other than David. In the end, you didn't get custody, but out of spite, you've been withholding child support payments, haven't you? She's lucky her family supported her so she could rebuild her life. Now she's working hard to become independent, even attending my cooking class. From what I've found, there's likely more dirt on you. And the affair partner? She's married, isn't she? David's face grew paler with every word. He had likely planned to pay off his infidelity with Sarah using compensation and then disappear. The fact that I was connected to the ex-wife he had abandoned and failed to support was clearly something he had never anticipated. David stammered, his voice shaking.
It's because I don't have any money. Really. When you have kids, you can get single-parent benefits and preferential treatment from work. It's not about Sarah. I just wanted a child. I never needed a wife.
Hearing those words, Patricia staggered backward and fell out of her chair in shock. If my own child ever said something like that, I'd probably faint on the spot. In essence, David wanted children for the financial benefits they could bring. But he had no desire for the burden of a spouse to tie him down. David, having finally confessed everything, looked utterly drained, his face as pale as a ghost. It was clear that all his past misdeeds had finally caught up with him. From behind me, Sarah, who had been silently watching David, slowly approached him and glared down at him.
So that's how it is. Using children for money? You're the lowest of the low. Fine, if that's how you want to play, I'll destroy you completely. Get ready.
The moment Sarah bared her fangs, David let out a small scream and began apologizing.
I'm sorry. I really am. Please, just don't go after me. My company relies heavily on your firm, and if we lose that connection, we're done.
Apparently, the company David worked for depended on Sarah's large corporation for the majority of its revenue. With Sarah's influence and advice from Charles, it was inevitable that David's actions would impact his employer. Desperately apologizing, David seemed to realize the severity of the situation, but it was far too late. I'll be pushing for severe consequences against you. You'd better prepare yourself for the reality that you won't be able to work in your current state. And I've decided, together with your ex-wife who you've been neglecting to pay child support to, that we'll hold you accountable and deliver the punishment you deserve. David, likely never expecting such an alliance between the women he had wronged, was utterly panicked. With his face a mess of tears and snot, he clung to us pitifully, but Patricia and George, whose patience had finally run out, practically carried him out of the house. Apologizing profusely, they assured us that David would pay for his actions before leaving our home. Later, word of David's misconduct spread not only within his company, but across the industry as well, leaving him unable to find work. After resigning from his job, David sold his luxury car to pay Sarah compensation for his infidelity. Since missing child support payments wasn't an option, George arranged for David to help at the family's store, ensuring a steady stream of payments. With George keeping a close eye on him, David couldn't escape and had his wages garnished monthly to cover the child support owed. As a result, there were no more missed payments. Currently, David has almost no freedom and is surviving on just a few $100s he has left. As a result, he has no room for any leisure activities. He's gradually becoming more haggard and seems to have lost the motivation to even leave the house, spending all his time holed up at home. Patricia and George are still in good health, so until their grandchildren no longer need child support, they've taken full responsibility for keeping David under close watch. Once their role is no longer necessary, they plan to move into a care facility together. In other words, what lies ahead for David is nothing but endless days of misery. Despite his extravagant spending habits, inability to save money, and even going into debt to buy a luxury car just for show, he still thought he could manipulate the system to gain more money through child benefits. But that plan has completely fallen apart. From now on, David will likely never lead a bright and hopeful life. He used Sarah's trust and emotions solely for his selfish desires, forcing her into pregnancy. Such a person is simply reaping what he sowed. Meanwhile, a few months later, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Now a single mother, Sarah is living with us. Grandchildren are unconditionally adorable. This is what I mean by unconditional love. Sarah has bonded with David's ex-wife, who had been struggling with unpaid child support, and now they've become good friends, supporting each other as single mothers. For my part, I'm delighted to watch over the growth of my precious daughter and granddaughter. Charles seems to feel the same way. Though he's usually reserved, I caught him smiling along with the baby whenever she laughed. Being able to help with parenting again in my 50s is a refreshing and rewarding experience for me. I firmly vowed to continue supporting my granddaughter's growth behind the scenes in the future.